I've never done one of these things before, no idea how it might go, so I hope you've got plenty of caffeine and sugar in you just in case. And I'm not 100% sure how long this is going to take either, just to warn you. The main subject that I was wanting to look at, and have been looking at recently, is the parliamentary roads that were associated with Thomas Telford, built in the early 1800s, of which there's a couple go through our Strath. But as with just about any history subject, where on earth do you start? The Parliamentary Roads Commission started in 1803, but why did it start? And what was there before? And we kind of have to look at that before we start looking at what we actually want to look at. And as well, we kind of want an idea of what this parish was like before. And there's a couple of, I guess, misapprehensions that some people, none of you I'm sure, sometimes have. First of all, we're thinking about what life was like. This parish, David and Dunlichty, in the mid-1700s, had a population that was nearly double what it is today. So don't be thinking that the Highlands hundreds of years ago were a sparsely populated wilderness. There was lots more people here, and they were probably better spread out through the Strath in some of the more, what we see as remote areas. The other thing is, how much did people travel? In the first statistical account, which was an account written of every parish in the 1790s, the account of this parish stated that there was quite a large population of people who migrated for work seasonally, heading south in the spring, doing agricultural work until the harvest was finished late autumn, and then coming back to this home here for the winter. And they would have largely been travelling down to East Lothian, maybe Lowland Perthshire, these kind of places. So back 250 years ago, we've got quite a lot of people that are travelling, right? So don't be thinking that people in the Highlands 250 years ago never went further than a mile from their doorstep. Looking through some of the first old statistical accounts, the 1790s, I came across another parish, and I never bookmarked it, so I can't remember which one it was, but I think it was one of the Lochaber parishes, where it's reported similar, large numbers of people travelling for agricultural work to the Low Countries, to Belgium, to Holland, and coming back for the winter. So back in the late 1700s, we had international commuters. Okay, they're not travelling quite the same way as we do today, but people travelled more than we think. However, I'm really looking tonight at roads that were built, engineered and built, rather than routes that were just tracks that organically formed by the passage of feet. And why is that important? Basically, because you need a hard road to use wheels. And why is that so important? Not just for them now, but for society. Well, again, for example, if you look at Strathnairn, 1790s, it says that they found a source of lime, agricultural lime, in the parish. And agricultural lime is fundamental for improving agriculture. Basically, you won't improve agriculture in the acidic Highlands unless you can put lime on it. If you can't improve agriculture, you're not producing an excess of food, there's no excess of labour that can move to cities, there's no industrial revolution, there's no modern society. There's a source of lime in Strathnairn. That might only be 3 or 4 miles from you as a little farmer there. And if you're only farming 10 acres, something like that, you might only need 20 or 30 tonnes. But if you can't use wheeled transport, how are you going to move that even 3 or 4 miles? You're either going to be putting it on your back and carrying it, and I would suggest you're not going to be doing that, or you're putting it in creels on the back of a horse, which probably wouldn't be able to carry much more than you, or this works, you're putting it on a sledge on the back of a horse, which again is not going to carry a huge amount. So basically, until you've got a hard road that you can put wheeled transport on, you're not moving stuff, especially not heavy stuff. That drawing is from about 300 years ago. That photo, which is not very clear, is from much more recently, and that's still a horse-drawn sledge being used. So some of these things are not so far in the distant past. So where do we start? Drove roads are quite important here. That drove road there goes through our parish, and that's quite an important drove road. However, drove roads, particularly in the Highlands, were not built roads. They were routes that people took cattle on. Drovers did not like built roads. Some of these cattle would have walked from Caithness to Southampton. And if they were doing that on a hard road, they would suffer. So I'm not talking about drove roads, so you can forget that. Although it is an interesting subject, and I think there is a lot of interesting local history of drove roads as well. Another day. So the first period of road building that we want to look at is what's known as statute roads. So in the mid-1600s, the government introduced a statute, or a law, which required everybody to do, initially it was 6 days, and then it was reduced to 4 days labour on the roads. It was organised locally, or regionally, I guess. The roads statute labour here was organised in Inverness. And it was variable as to how successful it was over geography and over time. Because the people were responsible for statute labour until, so from the mid-1600s through to the late 1800s. So you've got a 200-year period when people were doing this. It wasn't particularly liked by the average person, because the average normal person was responsible for an awful lot of free labour. I sometimes underestimate that. That's 4 days a year building roads, without pay, obviously. As a farmer, you would be a tenant of a taxman, the kind of big farmer. He required labour, and as part of your rental agreement, you'd be duty bound to give him so many days a year. The big landowner would also be requiring free labour off you for carrying stuff, for fetching peats for the big house. The miller would be requiring labour off you that you couldn't avoid, all during the summer when you need it on your farm. So it's not surprising that it didn't always work that efficiently or effectively. However, they did build roads. So there was an organisation called the Commissioners of Supply, which was, I guess, a group of respectable people, whoever they may be, who would meet in Inverness at the end of April every year for a full day. Sometimes it worked out to be 2 days, where they would decide who was working on what roads in the area and who was responsible for them. So we often see from the Commissioners of Supply them reporting things like this. So the road leading to the town towards the water of Nairn via Westward Drakes. This meeting allows for the said road the statute labour of the inhabitants of Kingswells, Castlehill and Inches Estate, Westward Drakes Estate, Drakes, Bogbane, Hill of Culloden, and then they nominate these guys for overseeing it, basically. We see these, if you go through the minutes of the statute of the Commissioners of Supply, we see this kind of thing repeatedly. They're not building roads fast. So this road via Westward Drakes, we see for more than a decade in the reports getting built. So the road from Inverness to the water of Nairn by Westward Drakes, that is most likely more or less the route of the A9. From Inverness over past Bogbane into David somewhere. Unfortunately, there's no maps associated with these Commissioners of Supply, so we're making assumptions here, but I think that's most likely. That's not the only road that they built that relates to us. There's mention of, well, this Westward Drakes road, there's mention of a road from Inverness to the River Nairn via Kilduffel, which, when you look at the old maps, sounds very much like the B861 that goes over above Slacknewey, because that was quite an old road, so that was probably a statute labour road that was built over here. There's mention of a Strathnairn road being built, And when they mention that, they mention that they're allocating £15 towards a bridge being built over the River Bryn. Now, the River Bryn is top end of Strathnairn, so I suspect that the Strathnairn road is actually from Strathnairn through to Strathnairn. This is really just the 1770s and 1780s that I find these in, because that's the period I was looking at. If anyone is that way inclined, there's 200 years worth of handwritten minutes of all their meetings in the Highland Archive Centre. There may well be other roads or things that they mention that relate to us, but that's a lot of time and old handwriting. At this stage, there's a good time to speak about the Tordaric Bridge. The Tordaric Bridge is interesting. There's not a lot recorded about it in obvious sources anywhere. It's a very narrow bridge. The width of the Tordaric Bridge is basically the minimum width you would build for a horse and cart to use. One way, not two-lane traffic. But it's still there. It should, however, be of no surprise that there is a bridge around that area over the River Nairn. Our parish, David and Dunlichty, is quite cleanly split in two by the River Nairn. And at times the River Nairn is quite an impassable barrier if there's no bridges on it. And that's a problem for a number of reasons. Obviously it stops those of us on the south side getting to Inverness. It probably stops folk visiting families and so on when the river's up. However, the other thing about this parish is that although we have two parish churches, one at Dunlichty and one at Daviot, they are both on the north side of the river. And that potentially causes a problem, not for getting to church on a Sunday morning, although that is an issue, but if you miss church on a Sunday morning, they're not going to come and get you. However, the graveyards are potentially a bigger problem. If your spouse dies in January and the river's in spate for weeks and you cannot get across the river to bury them, that does present real problems. And that's not an issue just for our parish. There's a few places around Scotland that have had that issue. And there are a number of bridges around Scotland that are known as coffin bridges, because we know they were specifically built, although of course for many purposes, but one of the purposes that they were built for was to access graveyards. That is a reasonably well-known one, which is Carr Bridge. It's built early 1700s, I think. And of course it was used for many purposes, but the guy that built it did record that that was one of the main reasons why he built it, was to access graveyards. So it's not to say that Tordaric Bridge is definitely a coffin bridge, but it's just to say that it shouldn't surprise us that people really wanted to cross the river somewhere further upstream from, say, Fairley, in order to access Dunlichty graveyard. So what do we know about Tordaric Bridge itself? Well, there are a few hints of records. In 1770, there was a guy called Bishop Forbes who did a bit of a tour of the Highlands, and he spent a fortnight staying at Tordaric and helpfully left us published diaries. And he said at Tordaric, "Here there is a wooden bridge made of large trees digged out of a moss, by which horses and wheeled machines do easily cross." So there was a bridge at Tordaric in 1770, but it was not this bridge. It was a wooden bridge. I'm told that a wooden bridge of that era had a lifespan of about 30 years. Whether that was the first wooden bridge there, or whether they had rebuilt them and repaired them over the generations, no idea. The next reference that I could find anywhere was in 1776 at the Commissioners of Supply, at their meeting in Inverness, at the end of April, when they are discussing roads and bridges. And there was a petition given to them, so a request from the heritors, it's big landowners, of Strathnairn requesting a bridge to be built over the River Nairn. Unfortunately, they don't tell us where they wanted a bridge, but the logical sites, because by this stage there's probably a bridge at Failey, so there shouldn't really be a great need to duplicate that further down the Strath. Possibly a bridge at Tordaracht or somewhere in that area, or possibly they could be referring to a bridge over the Nairn at Aberarder to allow access over towards Stratherick. Not sure. However, 2 years later, at the same meeting, so 1778, again at the Roads meeting of the Commissioners of Supply at the end of April, there was a petition from the ministers and elders of Davie and Dunlichty. Doesn't say what they were petitioning about, unfortunately, but it was addressed to the Roads meeting of the Commissioners of Supply, so you have to assume it's something to do with roads, transport, bridges. A couple of years after that, in 1781, we read, as an aid for building a bridge across the water of Nairn, opposite to Tordaracht, £10 sterling, and the same statute labour to work on the roads through Davie and Dunlichty, and the same commissioner to take direction. That's the same as last year. So it would appear that Tordaracht Bridge was built 1781 or shortly thereafter by statute labour. Now, I suspect that the £10 would have gone towards hiring a stonemason who knew what he was doing, because your statute labour is almost by definition unskilled. So, yeah, and I think that means that if your ancestors lived in the area in the 1780s, it's likely that they would have spent at least 4 days building this bridge, or at least doing the hard labour, moving stones and digging out the foundations to allow the stonemason to build it properly. The next main period of road building that we want to look at is the military roads. So, after the 1715 Jacobite Rising, the government really, or during the 1715, the government really struggled to get their army north. It more or less ground to a halt around Blair Atholl. So after that rising, General Wade was appointed Commander-Chief with the mission, as the national anthem would say, to crush the rebellious Scots. So he was not sent here to build roads and bridges, he was sent here as the occupying army. This is him. His initial commission wasn't about building roads, but in order to occupy Scotland, he needed to get there. He was building a network of forts, and he needed to be able to access them, to supply them, and to get in between them. And if you look under his hand, he's got a cannon. You'll struggle to drag a cannon through a bog. Hence, it's in his interests to have a hard road, not just for cannons, but armies need wagons full of supplies and all sorts, and they need to be able to move as fast as they can. So the red is what General Wade built. Basically a network of forts through the Great Glen and roads connecting them and heading south. As an aside, you will note the fort in Inverness was called Fort George, but it was not at Ardersier. The original Fort George was in Inverness on the site of the castle, or where the Inverness Castle is now. That was blown up in 1745 by the Jacobites. And the story goes that when they came to rebuild it in 1746, the Provost of Inverness, a guy called Mr. Hossack, did his absolute utmost to persuade them not to build it in Inverness, but to build it further out in Ardersier. And the rumour is the reason he was so adamant about that was that he had a couple of eligible daughters, and he really didn't want a garrison of soldiers in the town where his daughters lived. Wade's roads were only built in the summer. They came up in May, worked through till October, and then left. So the soldiers, when they were initially building the roads, would have headed back to Edinburgh. Wade would have headed back to, he was an MP, so he'd be back in London as well, and whatever his constituency was, I can't remember. And he was building roads in a hostile territory, really, which affected how he built roads. So he was really wanting to get them built fast, quickly, cheaply, I guess. So Wade largely avoided building bridges. He would much rather ford a river or even reroute the road to avoid building a bridge, because a bridge is militarily vulnerable, expensive, slow to build, and the army didn't have that many stonemasons, so he was relying on trying to hire local people. He didn't really account for things like slope. And I mean, if you look at where the road goes on the north side of Fairley, it just crashes straight up the hill, which doesn't make for easy to use roads. He often didn't account for drainage, how water or snow would lie on the road. Basically, they ended up not being very good. And one of the later surveyors that we came across later, if I can quote, said, Wade was no engineer. And if we look at that, which you probably can't see very well, that's actually a cross-section of the Wade Road, just a little bit south of Midlarks Quarry, that was done. And all they have done is dug away the topsoil until they got down to the hard ground, and that's it. Many military roads, they did lay a base of gravel, but here they appear not to have done that. Now, if that looks like a drainage ditch or a river channel to you, that's probably how it worked, how it acted. So, this road was built in the 1720s. 1740s, Lord Lovat, reports that he travelled this road from Inverness to Edinburgh. Took him 11 days. 3 times he broke his axles on his carriage, and he had to take his wheel right with him, which doesn't really suggest a great road. So General Wade actually only built about 40 bridges in Scotland, and a couple of hundred miles. So a lot of what we refer to as Wade bridges and Wade roads are not actually built by General Wade. His successor, General Caulfield, who came along in the 1740, built 600 or 700 bridges. So many of what we see is actually Caulfield-era bridges. And Caulfield worked in quite a different environment. The Highlands changed really fast after Culloden, going from a hostile environment to one that was much more integrated, huge numbers of people joining the British Army instead of fighting against them, and so on. So General Caulfield worked in quite a different environment. He was able to fill in a lot of these gaps, build a lot of these bridges on Wade's Road, and build a lot of new roads as well. As an aside, well, General Wade, one of the differences is General Wade only came here seasonally to campaign. Caulfield came here to live. So Caulfield lived in Cradle Hall, hence Cradle Hall on the edge of Inverness, just off Caulfield Road. And as a little diversion, I don't know if you all know why Cradle Hall was called Cradle Hall. The story goes that Caulfield was quite a hospitable chap, and if you went round to his house for dinner, he would be free with the wine, to the point where it's likely that you would not be standing up again at the end of the night. You would be cowping over backwards. And so, as you cowped away from the table, the servants would be able to move you into the cradle that was ready positioned, open the trapdoor in the roof or in the ceiling, winch you upstairs to the guest bedroom, and roll you into the guest bed. Now, I always thought this was ancient history, and it is ancient history. This is from the 1750s. However, I was speaking to a gentleman here just the other week who remembers seeing the cradle. So although it's not there now, it's not that long gone. And as another interesting aside, there is trace on some of the maps of a road going more or less from Fairley and cutting straight across to Cradle Hall House. It's just a mention, there's a few maps over there that we'll get to, there's a mention of it on one of them. So I wonder if you built a house from the River Nairn, bult a road from the River Nairn straight to his house. But that's just an idea seen from one of the maps. Anyway, Wade's Road from Dunkeld to Inverness obviously passes through our parish. Comes down through Midlargs Quarry, across Fairley Bridge, up the other side over into Inverness. It was built 1728, 1730, and it was abandoned in 1809 just as soon as they could possibly get onto another road. So as soon as there was another road built, it was more or less abandoned. That's the bridge at Fairley. Probably not Wade. We know there was an existing ford across the river there. Wade's surveyor, when they were planning the route of the road, mentioned that there was a ford there. There's various references to fords. So it probably wasn't General Wade. It was probably a later bridge by probably Caulfield. There is, of course, another military bridge in the parish. This one, which is hidden in the forest above Midlargs Quarry. Again, fairly certain that wouldn't be a General Wade bridge, probably a Caulfield bridge, mid to late 1700s. By the time we get to the 1770s, the budget for maintaining all these military roads and building the military roads moved from a military budget to being general government expenditure, because the military wasn't needing them as an active military campaign, really. And it was getting harder to justify spending what ended up being a lot of money trying to maintain them. To the point where in 1784, General Mackay, who was the military guy that took over the roads, said this in report to his superiors in London: "No regular system seems to have been laid down in carrying out this roads business. The roads have in many places been ill conducted, and excepting a few stages are in very bad repair. Number of bridges is 938. Many of them are insufficient, some ruinous, and others of those that were first built injudiciously constructed and ill executed." Given that this was one of the military guys criticising one of his own predecessors, it's pretty negative. So by the end of the 1700s, the road network, particularly the military road network, was rubbish, basically, in a world that was becoming, or in the Highlands, was becoming increasingly connected and changing in quite a big way, really. The days of the Highlands rising against the government had changed to the Highlands really being known as a breeding ground for men to go and join the army and fight for the government. There was huge increases in trade, particularly with cattle. Napoleonic Wars really drove the price of cattle high, which had a big impact on the economy here for some people. Of course, not everybody benefits from these things. We're starting to see the coming of sheep, clearances, that kind of thing. So it's a massively changing world by the end of the 1700s. And by the turn of the century, the government realised that they had problems in the Highlands. And one of the problems that they really were worried about was emigration, which again is maybe not something we think of. We know that the clearances were a huge problem. We know that some of those responsible for the clearances were members of the government by virtue of their landowning and so on. But actually the government was worried about the clearances. They weren't particularly concerned, I don't think, about individuals' emotional states, but they were concerned about recruitment for the army and the navy, army in particular, because the Highlands had become a massively important source of men. And when they started seeing tens of thousands of people leaving the country, they were worried. because this was a period of almost continual war, particularly through the Napoleonic era. To the point where there was even a brief period where the government tried to ban emigration. It didn't work or last very long, but they tried it briefly. Of course, there was also a desire to get more out of the Highlands, develop the economy so that more can be contributed. So, in response to this, the government appointed Thomas Telford in 1801 and initially asked him to go and survey the Highlands with a view to setting up fishing stations, developing ports to develop a fishing industry, because there wasn't a massive fishing industry in Scotland then. Which he did and came back to them, and the government promptly told him to go and do another survey in 1802 with a slightly broader remit to look at fisheries again, to look at the Caledonian Canal and see whether they could have sufficient water supply and so on to build the Caledonian Canal, to look at communications, roads and bridges, and to look at the causes of emigration and the means of preventing it. So Telford reported back on that, and almost straight away the government set up the Commissioners for Highland Roads and Bridges. And they started work almost immediately. So the Commissioners for Highland Roads and Bridges was a committee, I guess, set up by the government. And it consisted of the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Lord Advocate, the Lord Privy Seal of Scotland, Commissioner for Woods and Forests, and 6 Highland gentlemen. And if you think about that, that's several of the highest offices of state in the country. Not just in Scotland, that's some of the top politicians in the country, with the exception of the Prime Minister, basically. I can't imagine any government committee today having that kind of firepower in terms of the people that are appointed to it. So they were taking this very seriously. And they then appointed people they were able to, had a budget, they could spend money, and they appointed people to do the actual work. And the success of the Parliamentary roads, which is what we're on now, and it was very successful, really was down to the people that were involved on the ground. So, just as background, we had Thomas Telford, who's the famous name. He was a stonemason from Dumfriesshire, but he'd worked his way to becoming an engineer. In those days, because everything was built with stone, you often found that stonemasons were doing engineering jobs. It was the stonemasons that were building that you needed if you wanted to build a bridge or any big construction. And he had an international reputation even by this stage. Whilst he was doing work in the Highlands with roads and the Caledonian Canal, he was also building a canal in Sweden. He was also building great big bridges in Wales and so on. So he was a global engineer. As a result, he couldn't be on site in the Highlands all the time. So there was other people working with him. A guy called James Hope, who was the lawyer in Edinburgh, who dealt with all the legal stuff. There was a guy called John Rickman, who was the clerk of the House of Commons. So he was the one who was able to pull a lot of strings and get things organised in the House of Commons in London. But for the day-to-day running of stuff, he appointed a guy called John Mitchell, who was a stonemason from Forres. And then John Mitchell actually died relatively young, and his son, Joseph Mitchell, succeeded him as superintendent of all the roads in the Highlands. And I'm going to read now a quote, so in the late 18-teens, 17, 18-ish, a guy called Robert Southey, who was a poet laureate at the time, so it's a quite long wordy quote, spent a summer, several weeks, touring all the roads in the Highlands with Thomas Telford and John Mitchell, and helpfully wrote a book. So this was his impressions of John Mitchell, so the superintendent that looked after all the roads. Mr. Telford found him a working mason who could scarcely read or write, but his good sense, his good conduct, steadiness and perseverance have been such that he's been gradually raised to be inspector of all these Highland roads which we have visited, and all which are under the Commissioner's care. an office requiring a rare union of qualities, amongst others inflexible integrity, a fearless temper, and an indefatigable frame. Perhaps no man ever possessed these requisites in greater perfection than John Mitchell. No fear or favour in the course of 15 years have ever made him swerve from the performance of his duty, though lairds, with whom he has to deal, have omitted no means to make him enter into their views, and do things, or leave them undone, as might suit their humour or interest. They have attempted to cajole and to intimidate him equally in vain. They've repeatedly preferred complaints against him in the hope of getting him removed from his office, and a more flexible person appointed in his stead. And they have not infrequently threatened him with personal violence. Even his life has been menaced. But Mitchell holds right on. In the midst of this most laborious life, he has laboured to improve himself with such success that he's become a good accompanyant, makes his estimates with faculty, carries on his official correspondence in a respectful and able manner. In the execution of his office, he travelled last year not less than 8,800 miles, and every year he travels as much. Nor has his life, the exposure to all winds and weathers and the temptations, either of company or of solitude at the houses in which he puts up, led him into any irregularities or intemperaments. Neither has his elevation in the slightest degree inflated him. He is still the same temperate, industrious, modest, unassuming man as when his good qualities first attracted Mr. Telford's notice. Inverness is his home, he's a married man, and has several fine children. To an extent, that could be applied to all the 5 key guys involved in this, in that they do very much appear to have been public servants who were motivated to do the right thing and try to improve things. Also note that hardship, particularly that John Mitchell experienced, he's travelling 8 to 10,000 miles a year. He's doing it in winter and summer. In fact, some of the harder work, you see some of the accounts of what they're doing when bridges come down in the winter or whatever, in storms, and how fast they're out there in all weathers trying to repair things. John Mitchell died when he was late 30s, I think, or about 40 maybe, and it is repeatedly said probably died early because he spent such a hard life out on the road in all weathers. And when we look through the accounts of what they're spending money on, of course there's all the money they spend on roads and so on and so on, there's quite often a line in there, great quotes for the roads inspectors, and not just a few shillings. There was serious money getting spent buying these guys best great coats they could have, because they were out in all weathers at all times of year doing this. So how did it work? There was the initial survey that Thomas Telford did in 1802. He had identified a good number of roads or routes that he thought would really benefit from roads being built, but also local people could apply. And when I say local people, not your landless crofter, the heritable landowners. And it kind of had to be them, because the government was funding 50% of the roads, the local heritable landowners had to find the other 50%. So they had to be on one side. There are 2 parliamentary roads that go through our parish. So from Inverness, there is this road that goes to Moy, which is called the Moy Road. And from Daviot, there's a road that goes all the way through Strathnairn, Strathnairn, and down past Inverfarragate down to Loch Ness, which is known as Inverfarragate Road. The Moy Road, the yellow road, is the old military road, General Wage Road. So the Moy Road was built directly to replace this section of military road. Slightly different route, does the same job. The Inverfarragate Road was obviously for local benefit, but connected to a pier that was built at Inverfarragate, which was built as part of the Caledonian Canal project. So we're integrating into the Caledonian Canal network on this road. Caledonian Canal was being built, it started being built a few years after the Parliamentary Road started, but they overlapped by, well, basically they overlapped the whole way through. So once a road has been identified as a likely candidate, it gets surveyed. And you'll not be able to see that very well, but that is the original map that the surveyor, Mr. William Cumming, did of the Moy Road. And afterwards, I've got a copy of it there printed out, which you can see in much more detail. So that surveyed map contains a lot of the information that a roads contractor would need. Not just the route, it's got descriptions of the lengths of the road, what kind of environment it's going through. Sometimes they mention there's gravel available here for construction materials, there's soft ground you're going through. And it would be accompanied by a detailed specification, exactly how the contractor has to build this road. This map and the specification would then get lodged locally. So perhaps in the local inn, perhaps in Craggy, perhaps with the local school teacher. I'm not sure where the Moy Road was lodged with, but it would have been somewhere local. It was then advertised, and anybody could come, look at the map, have a look at the route, look at the specification, and decide if they were wanting to bid for this contract. In some ways, it was quite a modern way of contracting stuff, and that hadn't really been seen before. And that meant that the Roads Commission had, through bitter experience, they learned that they had to be really careful. Where are you going to get enough expert stonemasons and road builders to embark on a huge road building project in the Highlands when there had been relatively little before? At a time when the Caledonian Canal was sucking in every experienced stonemason and contractor, for not just in the Highlands, from an awful lot came along from Murrayshire, from Aberdeenshire, and from further south. So there were people bidding for these roads who maybe didn't have the skills and experience to successfully build them. And they're bidding for a fixed price contract. So whatever they get accepted at, they have to build it, or they have to deliver a road for that price. And if they go over budget, that's their problem. They've made a loss, they have to find that money. And so they were required to have financial guarantees, people who were willing to put up money in case they went over budget, so that that road got finished, in order to protect the public purse, I guess. So, the Moy Road. This was requested in 1805. It wasn't one of Telford's initial ones, but the Duke of Gordon and a few other people requested it in 1805. In 1807, Donald Mackintosh and partners were appointed to build this road. In the records, we don't really get a lot of information about them, which is probably a good thing. Nothing seemed to go wrong. They appear to have been competent in what they did. They were reported, as an aside, the Commission for Highland Roads and Bridges had to write a report every year or 2 years to the government to account for what they'd done, what they spent all the money on over the last year, 2 years. And that's one of our best sources about this. There's lots of information in there. So in the 1809 report, they say about the Moy Road contractors, they have proceeded with an attention and perseverance very much to their credit. Signed off as complete in 1809, 5 months ahead of schedule. The only large structure on it, really, is this, which is the bridge at Daviot. There's not that much to say about the Moy Road. Inverfarragig Road, on the other hand, is somewhat more involved. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the survey map. There's none in any of the archive centres. It appears to have been lost, which is kind of frustrating because it would be really nice to know what was originally planned. The best I can do is this, which is not an accurate survey. There's things in that map that just don't look right. I think it's basically General Roy's map that they've drawn across. But that's the route from Daviot through. This was actually one of the really early roads. So within weeks of the establishment of the Commission for Roads and Bridges, the Commissioners of Supply in Inverness had written to them, literally within less than a month, asking for this road from Craggy through to Inverfarragy. So pretty quickly, they asked a military surveyor called James Donaldson to survey the road. Now, James Donaldson had surveyed a couple other roads for the Commission. And he's one of these characters which you get hints of in the official records, that there must be a story behind this guy. Obviously, the official records don't tell you the things that have gone wrong, the problems they've had on a personal level, but there's just little things about this guy. So, he was a military surveyor, probably the military surveyor, responsible for all the Army's work on the roads in the north of Scotland. I first encountered him in about 1802. He's realigning the road over the Slough. And it appears that it's not just surveying that, he's overseeing, supervising the work to realign that as well. And Thomas Telford also encountered him in 1802, possibly, quite probably, when he came over the Slough, met him working. And in Thomas Telford's report that he gave back to the government, he suggested this guy, James Donaldson, should be the most knowledgeable person about the current state of roads in the Highlands. You should speak to him. So the government did, and they pulled him in for an interview, or for a discussion. And one of the first things they found out was that James Donaldson admitted that despite being the surveyor for all the military roads in the Highlands, he had never personally been west of Fort Augustus. The report, the government report that counts this, ends fairly suddenly after that. And you get the feeling that that discussion ended fairly suddenly because they weren't interested in second or third hand information, and if he hadn't been there, they weren't interested. Anyway, he surveyed the Inverfarragy road. He was asked to survey it from Craggy to Inverfarragy. He produced a survey from Fairley to Inverfarragy, which you can see why he might have done if he thought it was better to tie it into the military road network at Fairley. However, that was not what he was asked to do, and that led to some discussions as to actually what was best, what should we be doing here. The people responsible here weren't sure of the conclusion. They ended up getting Thomas Telford involved, who said, I can't decide unless I come and have a look, so they had to wait for him to come up to have a look, to have an inspection of the area around Daviot to see what was best. And eventually he said, and they all agreed, no, do the original route to Craggy, not to Fairley. But that took time, a year, 2 years, maybe more. The other thing that delayed this road was the route of this road goes through a lot of different landowners' properties. And if you need to get all the landowners on board, that involved quite a lot of people you're trying to coordinate. And again, the feeling you get from reading the reports is that trying to get all these landowners aligned was a little bit like trying to herd cats together, and that took them time, a lot more time than they thought. So although this road was proposed in 1803, it was 1807. It took them 4 years before they were able to appoint a contractor to start building it. So the Inverfarragy Road, which, by the way, is basically the B851. Our current road is this road. Was built by John and Donald Campbell, who were road builders, and Malcolm McPherson, who was a stonemason, and they were all from Rothimarcus, and their financial backers were also from that part of the world, in Rothimarcus. Note, we've got a stonemason here. This road actually has 29 bridges on it, or the original contract was for 29 bridges. 28 of them were stone-built bridge, 1 timber bridge. Although none of them are massive bridges, there's no dramatic huge bridges, 28 stone bridges is quite a lot. You really want your mason to know what he's doing, or you're in trouble. So, the first report that we get in the 1809 report So they entered into a contract. It was, what's that, a 3.5-year contract. The work hitherto performed by them excels in quality, but the progress has not been such to afford any expectation of completion within the time appointed. In length, only 1/4 of the road, mostly at the west end, is finished, but as this is the most rugged part that has been first executed, 1/3 of the road is supposed to be accomplished, but very few of the bridges are yet built. Shortly after this, we see this, which is a newspaper article from 1809, February 1809. A contractor is wanted for building the following bridges on the Inverfarragate Road. And that's not just one or two bridges that they're advertising. So this is, it says at the bottom, John Campbell. So one of the road builders is advertising, looking for a bridge builder. And he's looking for a bridge builder to build 19 out of the 28 bridges, including all of the big bridges. We do have, although we don't have the map of the Inverfarragate Road, in the archives there is the original contract signed by these guys, which is pages and pages of detailed explanation of exactly the makeup of the road, the size of the drains, so on and so on. And that lists exactly what bridges and how big each bridge is to be. So we're looking for contractors to build bridges. It looks like Campbell and McPherson bridges is their problem. In 1811, the next roads report simply says the job was conducted by the contractors in an unexceptional manner. The road was, well, it was due Martinmas 1810, so that's November. It was eventually signed off about 6 months late in April 1811. The next road report says that they made a loss due to not allowing for accidents and contingencies. Now we know, and I'll get to it in a minute, that one of the biggest bridges on the road collapsed during construction. And the roads contractor who was doing it was responsible for everything until everything was finally signed off. They couldn't sign off bits as it went. They had to be responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of everything until the final bit of the road was inspected, approved and signed off. So a bridge that collapsed during construction, that was their problem. They had to fix it. Whether that was their only problem or not, I suspect not, but we're just trying to see. So the road cost just over £4,000, but it must have cost the contractors quite a bit more. They made a loss on this. So that's a summary of the two roads. I just want to, there are a few interesting things along the roads, interesting places. So we're going to go on a quick tour, I hope, of some of the interesting places. So that is Daviate Bridge. I have no doubt that that was the original in this picture, and it's still there. It doesn't quite look like that anymore. You see, in 1925, so this photo was taken just prior to that, in 1925 there was a massive upgrade of the Highland Road, the A9. That's when it was tarred. An awful lot of the old bridges were knocked down and replaced. One or two of the old bridges were upgraded, and this is one of them. So in 1925, they basically shuttered it and poured a whole load of mass concrete on it to widen it and to raise the level of it. So what we see today, if you've ever been to look at that old bridge at Daviate, which is not the easiest to get at, looks like a rotten concrete bridge, and it is a rotten concrete bridge, but underneath it is the original. And actually, if you go underneath the bridge, you can see that layer of concrete on the edge, which has widened the bridge by about 7 feet. Moving on a little bit, that is the bridge at Little Mill. That's listed as a Category 2 listed building, original 1809 bridge, but it's not. There was probably the biggest flood that we've recorded in recordable history here was in 1829, and that was a very well documented flood. There was a book, at least one book, written at the time, documenting it. And that identifies that that night, 2 bridges in Strathnairn collapsed. One at Dunmaglass and one at Altrua. The bridge at Altrua, the Highlands, the Roads Commission refers to it as Redburn. That's kind of literal translation-ish. So Altrua or Redburn. I'm not aware of anything in this strath called Altrua or Redburn. However, we've got some clues. The reports for the Highland Roads and Bridges lists the bridge at Redburn as having 2 arches of 20 feet. There is only one bridge on the Inverfarragy Road of 2 arches of 20 feet. Littlemore Bridge. To confirm that, I'll not read that, I don't think. This is the Ordnance Survey name books from the first of the Ordnance Survey. Sent guys round, tracking down all the names. We can still access the books that they originally surveyed. And here we have the Altrua, scored out and replaced with the, Altrua Thick, which is the burn that goes under Littlemore. So it would appear that that burn used to be called Altrua, and for whatever reason has changed names, and the past name has been completely forgotten, as far as I'm aware, and therefore nobody has correctly identified the bridge that was over that burn. So this bridge did collapse in 1829. It was rebuilt again by a guy called John Davidson from Inverness, who did this one and the Dunmaglass Bridge for £220, 2 bridges to get rebuilt. Interestingly, Lauder, who was the guy that wrote the book of the 1829 flood, blames the collapse of this bridge on poor workmanship. However, we've also got the contract for rebuilding this bridge. When I say we, I don't have it, it's an archive centre in Edinburgh. And that contract requires the contractor to excavate a lot of gravel out the river channel upstream from that bridge and build up the banks, which suggests to me that there might have had a problem with the river moving, because that's an issue that is referred to repeatedly in the Highlands Roads and Bridges reports throughout Strathnairn. And it seems to be a particular problem in Strathnairn. You get more references to it here than any of the other projects. You know, the concern about rivers moving, bursting out their banks and going round a bridge and undermining it, cutting through the road behind the bridge. So it does seem that the River Nairn is kind of particularly prone to this. And as an aside, it's not just the River Nairn, it's obviously all the tributaries coming to it. And I live right next to the River Bryn, and the likelihood of that bursting its banks and washing the road away, avoiding the bridge and washing the road away, has increased a lot in the last few months. We're kind of watching it happen. Yeah. Moving on. Does anybody recognise that building? It could be your house, but it's not. That is the Dunwoody Tall House near Lockerbie, which is a nationally significant Category 1 listed Thomas Telford Toll House. That is the Old Inn at Farr. They are very similar. The only difference really is there's no bay window here. Now, that's because there was no tolls on the Inverfarragy Road at any point. And the tall house wanted a bay window so the tollkeeper could sit in the window and see traffic coming from both directions. This was built before the Dunwoody Toll House, but it does very much seem to be an identical building. So it was nothing to do with the roads contract, the original roads contract, but it was built just a few years after by Macintosh of Farr. So it looks like, just looking at it, that you probably got the plans off the shelf from the Roads Commission, from Thomas Telford. So, we've not got documentary evidence proving it, but that is very likely a Thomas Telford designed toll house that's been used as an inn. And it was used as an inn We know this because newspaper advert in 1821, the new house intended for an inn, stable attached, lately built on the property of Mr. Mackintosh and Farr, to let. And it was used as an inn through till mid-1850s, something like that, and then it reverted to estate accommodation. It was a gardener's house, it was a forester's house. It's back to being a gardener's house. Just as another random aside, this advert says it is intended to establish a cattle market to be held regularly at this place. I don't know if there ever was a cattle market established in that area. They were obviously talking about it at some time. Moving on a bit, and for this next location, I've got a letter here. There was a letter written by Fraser of Lovat and Mackintosh to Alan Rickman, who was a lawyer in Edinburgh, who dealt with a lot of the correspondence for these things. And he's asking for they're asking or highlighting a few things. They're highlighting problems with the River Bryn, undermining the bridge. But also, it's quite long, we regret that the communication from the south to the north of the River Nairn, near the march between Farr and Flickety, has not been placed in a situation of more general utility to make an easier and shorter access from the Inverfarragy Road on the south side of the river to the county road on the north side, leading to the two churches and the burial grounds and Inverness. At the same time, we're satisfied that the circumstances which led the surveyor to choose a situation was it being a better foundation with rock on each side that would be less expensive and more useful than a more useful situation for the county. And if a bridge shall be continued there and rebuilt, as the former one, before it was completely finished, fell down last year, we beg leave to observe that the approach to it is so difficult by natural obstacles that the bridge would be totally useless unless the board would be pleased to make a proper road. Can you give us £30? A couple of things. Note again the importance of being able to cross that river, yes, to get to Inverness, but also to get to churches and the burial ground. Also, second thing there is, you are all familiar with the bridge over the River Nairn between Farr and Flickety? If not, if you go to Milton Woods, down to the river, start walking upstream. First thing you'll notice, the banks are all deep sand. They're grassed over, so you don't really notice it, but when you start looking at it, you really wouldn't want to be building bridge foundations there. Keep going upstream. At Sauchie, it narrows. You start occasionally getting some rocks in the bank. As you get to the upstream end of Sauchie, you will see this, which is not a very clear photo. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to chop all the trees down. But this is on the north side of the river, looking back, so the road runs along here. Just where the road narrows, up about here, this is the bridge abutment, sticks up, that's the level road surface, that's down the other side. And on the side that I'm standing taking the photo, we've also got level road approaching the Ed raised up. So the abutments, the access road is all still there. It's just it's very well hidden amongst, particularly in summer, amongst the bracken. It's very difficult to see. Digging through the records, we find that the request was granted. They spent £36 improving this road to access the bridge, and obviously it was rebuilt after it collapsed in 1809. And we find details. It was a 36-foot bridge that was built, and that is, well, the two biggest bridges on this road were this one and the bridge at Dunmaglass, 36 feet. So this bridge would have looked the same, basically, as the big bridge at Dunmaglass. There's also reference to a small branch road as part of the Parliamentary Road contract, leading towards Tordarich. This is where it's particularly frustrating that we don't have the contract map to see exactly where they were putting a road. But we know, because the contract is very specific, the Inverfarragy Road was 19 miles, 1,128 yards long. And if you kind of measure the road distance, we're missing almost a mile, which would have been this branch road that went across the river here. I'm pretty sure that's it. That road is actually slightly wider than you think because the fence line is down on the road surface. The road's another metre, that's the edge of the road there. And that road comes round and joins the road that goes from Bryn towards Tordara. This is just before it comes out. I don't know how you describe that bit of road between Bryn and Tordara. So, we know the origins of this bridge. We don't really know anything documented about what happened to it. There's a few hints and clues, but we would just be speculating, really, and responsible historians don't speculate. I'm not a responsible historian, so let's speculate. There's no records of it in the Commission reports. The Commission ended in 1863. If there had something happened to this, they would have reported it somewhere. So it probably survived beyond 1863. If we look at the first series 1-inch ordnance survey map, this is the current road. This is the bridge over the river. It appears to still be there. The fact that it's half hidden under the H of Lochan doesn't help us, and I suspect has led to future errors in it being there or not being there. But it does appear to be there. This map was surveyed between 1866 and 1870. Shortly thereafter, the Ordnance Survey decided they needed to do 6-inch maps, so they started resurveying. So in 1871, they sent surveyors back, and this is the approach road, and it appears there's no bridge. So we can speculate that it's collapsed sometime between 1866 and 71. Was there anything that happened then? Well, there was a big flood, 31st of January 1868, which is notable because that flood brought down the town bridge in Nairn, quite a big bridge in Nairn. So there was obviously a significant amount of water in the Nairn that night. There's no record of our bridge being the one that collapsed. However, we've got to accept that we are a fairly insignificant backwater, and that bridge collapsing might not have made the front page of the P&J. I've also heard rumours that when the bridge collapsed, somebody died. I don't know whether that was when the bridge collapsed in 1809 or when it collapsed at the end of its lifespan. I've also heard it said that the bridge collapsed when a funeral procession was going over it. Some of you may know more, and if you do, I would love to know. Moving on. This is the bridge at Dunmaglass, and this is an absolutely brilliant example of a Thomas Telford bridge. The specifications of it, the angle of the batter on it, the shape, the curve of it, the shape of all the sizes of the stones and stuff, it's a really good example of it. You can just about see, again, rubbish photos, walls on the banks built. That's downstream, but also they go upstream quite a bit as well. So it's not just the bridge that's built, they've built containment along the walls as well. And if you look really closely, that's looking down below the bridge, they have built up the riverbed as well. That's huge stones being set like cobbles in the riverbed. And they must be set pretty well, because they've survived a couple of 100 years worth of floods, and it looks like none of them have moved. So whoever built this bridge, and this was one of the bridges that they were advertising to subcontract out, did really a pretty good job. Interestingly, this is also a listed building, listed as an 1830 rebuild after the 1829 flood. A lot of reports and various people report that the bridge at Dunmaglass collapsed in that flood. However, they only report the bridge at Dunmaglass collapsed. How many bridges are at Dunmaglass? 3. A 36-foot bridge, there's a 20-foot bridge, and there's an 8-foot bridge. You notice the 36-foot bridge because it's big and obvious, and the other 2 bridges you largely drive across without even noticing they're there. What was the contract for rebuilding the bridge that collapsed in 1829? For a 20-foot bridge. actually, this big bridge at Dunmaglass is an original one. The records are wrong. That one is a smaller 20-foot bridge that collapsed and was rebuilt. As an aside, when we look at the bridges that were put out for subcontracting in that newspaper advert, and you compare that with the bridges on the original contract, you can kind of work out which bridges Malcolm McPherson managed to build before they started putting them out to subcontract. The largest bridge that he managed to build was the only 20-foot bridge on the road, which is this one. I may be miscrying the poor man, but it would appear that the biggest build, not only did he struggle to build all the bridges, the biggest bridge that he did build collapsed. To the end of the road, where its destination is Inverfarraig Pier. It was built part of the Caledonian Canal, so the cost was all associated with that, and the government paid for that. It was built by some really professional builders who were trusted by Telford, built a lot of the other big bridges around the Highlands. That photo is from 1890-ish. That's the pier today. That's the original pier. It was extended in the 1860s, not quite such high quality, but it was there. Also, that is from the 1890s, and that's the steamer timetable. You could get from Inverfarraig a steamer in the morning and sail all the way to Oban without making any changes. I think nowadays that would be called an integrated public transport network. So that's the end of that road. The Roads Commission largely stopped taking new commissions for roads around about 1810-ish. Although they were still building, finishing off contracts, and they were still maintaining roads, seeking to make small improvements, replacing bridges that fell down, that kind of stuff. But there was no more big road projects being built. Until, in 1827, a guy called Lord Colchester came to visit the Highlands. He had been the Speaker of the House of Commons for 15 years, recently retired, and as a result, as Speaker of the House of Commons, he was the chair of the Highlands Roads and Bridges Commission. So he was deeply involved in it. I'm not sure if he'd ever been to Scotland before, if this was a retirement, see his life's work kind of thing. Anyway, he came, spent the summer touring with Mitchell, and he was absolutely delighted with what he saw. And as a result, he turned to Mitchell and instructed Mitchell, Joseph Mitchell this time, the road superintendent, start surveying for more roads. And this was the guy who had enough influence, was able to pull enough strings to make it happen, to get money out of the government. We'll build more roads, we'll make things better. So, looks like we're back in business building roads. The obvious thing that needs improved is the Highland Road, or the route from Inverness to Perth. A lot of it's still military road, not great. Bits of it have been improved, but it's not so great. The other thing, I don't know if you ever noticed when you're driving it, it's a massive S shape. If you were to draw a straight line down there, that would be much shorter, about 40 miles shorter. And that's significant. It's maybe not so significant if you're in your car sitting at whatever speed you sit at, but if you're walking or plodding along behind an ox cart, saving 40 miles is a huge deal. So, and that road wasn't really used as much as we see it now. So, for example, the post from Inverness south all went via Aberdeen. And when we start getting to this period, the late 1820s, there's a lot of complaints, people writing to MPs, pressure being put on the post office, saying, look, send the mail direct. And the post office saying, no, we're not sending our wagons up that road, we're going via Aberdeen. And it was beginning to become an issue. So, Joseph Mitchell started looking at how he could improve this. So this map is on its side. We've got Inverness here, Perth down here. And he started looking, didn't survey properly, but just made sketch plans of how to cut the first bit of the big S of the A9 off. So that's the current A9. So we've got an option here of coming off Blair Athol and going up through Glenfeshie, across the top of the River Dee, and down Glenfeshie. That's a road that General Wade surveyed, never built, was thought about here. When we say it's never built, people used it as a road, but not as a properly built road. So that was talked about as late as 1960s, early 1970s maybe. They were still talking about building that road, never did. The advantage of that is it links into Braemar down there. There was an alternative route that goes up Glenbrewer, across Gate, down Glentrome. So they looked at those, and it was pointed out to them there were a few downsides to this, particularly some of these stretches of Perthshire Road had been improved by the Parliamentary roads at great cost, and so to build this new road you'd be basically making that previous bits that they spent a lot of money on redundant, and you'd be relying on the same large landowners to fund this new road, who had already funded this old road. And it was not going to be cheap. They're looking at £60,000 to £80,000 for either of those, which, when you consider that the Inverfarragy road was £4,000, £4,500, a lot of money. So that was quickly abandoned, and they started looking at the northern section, which is where we get an interest. And this, trying to cut the corner on the northern section of what's now the A9, had been something that had been talked about for a little while. Mackintosh of Moy had been pushing it for a few years. He'd been putting articles in the newspaper trying to persuade other landowners that this would be a great idea. It's not just benefiting us, it's benefiting everybody north of Inverness, shortening this road, making this road better. So Joseph Mitchell did a full survey of this road. I have the maps over there. There's three big maps, which you can have a look at later, because you won't see that properly. But this was a fully costed survey with all the technical details in it, ready to go out to contract. So the road, we're coming from coming right from Inverness, basically following, going up above Slackdewy, B861, except we're not. We're improving the B861 by reducing the slope on it, because it's quite steep in places, coming down through Balnafoy Crossroads, crossing Inverarney, and then round the other side of the road over the Carnacy, through the top of Strathnairn, all the way down to Newtonmore. Fully costed £32,000 was what they estimated it at, so significantly cheaper than the southern roads. And to us this sounds a little bit crazy, putting a road right through the middle of the Monolea Mountains. It's maybe not quite as crazy as you think. The alternative is the Slocht. The Slocht was a difficult, dangerous road. The Roads Commission's already spent money putting railings at the side of the road to try and make it safer, because when you go over the Slocht on the south side, you're on a massively built up embankment. Before that was built up, you were going down a really steep, craggy slope. It was known as dangerous. It was quite high up, not as high as this road, but still quite high. And that Slocht road is going to need a whole bunch of money spent on it to improve it. Sooner or later, might not have cost much less than building this road. This is high up, going through the Monolea Mountains, but so is the A93 at Glenshee, about the same height, so not completely unreasonable. And it's not really a complete wilderness. There were people in there. A lot of that route follows either Drove Road or roads leading up to Sheelings that were well used and well populated. So in 1829, this road was included in the government's plan for draft bills to go through Parliament in 1830. So not only have we fully surveyed this road, we've fully costed it, we've got everything ready for putting it to contractors. The government is on board, they just need to vote it through, but they're the government, they've got the numbers, they can vote through the budget for it. We're just about ready to go. 1829, Lord Colchester died. I suspect that wouldn't have stopped the road, although he was pulling strings and making it work. In 1827, Mackintosh of Moy died. He was one who'd been pushing it quite hard. His successor, who had recently returned from America, who lived in America for years and years, was quite against it. And he was a key landowner that needed to be on board. Duke of Gordon died in 1827. He was a key landowner in Badenoch that would have needed to support it. When he died, he had debts that would bring a tear to your eye. He sold off all his estates in Badenoch, and it still nearly never made a dent in his debts. So they were in no position to support it. The Heritors of Inverness, kind of organisation, discussed it, eventually voted on it, and voted against it. They objected because it was going through an unpopulated area. They were worried about it being blocked with snow in the winter. Fair comments, but reading between the lines, I don't think they want to spend the money. Well, nobody wants to spend money, but the world of the Highlands in the late 1820s was very different from the Highlands in the early 1800s. Without spending another 2 hours, a lot of the economy in the Highlands changed in 1815. Two things happened in 1815, probably more, but two significant ones. There was a large volcano erupted in Indonesia, nothing to do with us, except that was the year without a summer, which meant massive crop failure, heading towards famine. Next couple of years, still had really bad harvests because of this volcano. So the economy has suffered. Also in 1815, even more significantly, and whether you call it bad news or good news, was the Battle of Waterloo, which meant that there was peace in Europe. For the past 20 or so years, or more, the Napoleonic Wars have driven a massive boom in the economy here. The demand for cattle, you join the army or the navy, you get fed beef every day. Where does the beef come from? An awful lot of it comes from the Highlands. The price of cattle went fourfold during the Napoleonic Wars. As soon as there was peace, it crashed. Sometimes they couldn't even sell cattle. And all the soldiers, there was no longer work for people signing up as soldiers. There's a lot less army officers on half pay coming back, spending the money. Just a lot less money about. And that applied to everybody. These rich landowners would have been struggling with people not paying their rents and so on. And that's before we get into potato famines and so on in the succeeding years. So the economy really in 1830 was rubbish, and that's probably what stopped this road. But they were close to building it. It was just about ready to go. They just needed to vote it through, and they would have been ready to go. In 1834, they turned their attention to the Slough and did a reasonable sized project improving the road in the Slough, and it was a massive project. They had the embankments they built were 75 feet tall. The peat on the summit of the Slough, they reported as being 40 feet deep. They had to dig through huge trenches in the peat to try and lay a road through it. It was a massive project, and once they've spent that money on the Slough, there's no chance they're going to spend money on an alternative to it here. To conclude, the parliamentary roads that we see, and I was trying to find a clear map that showed where they all are in the Highlands, just to show you how similar it is to our current road network. But the parliamentary roads are very much the basis of what our current road network is. To the point where, if you dig a hole through the B851 out there, you will probably find stones that Campbell and Macpherson laid, as they laid them, just underneath tar. I drove across an original 1810 bridge to get here this evening. So if we look back at the original aims of the Parliamentary Commission for Highland Roads and Bridges, did they achieve their aims? Well, it was a massively successful programme, and in establishing a network of roads and bridges that shaped the Highlands as we know today. They were massively successful. One of their other aims was of preventing immigration. To quote Joseph Mitchell in the 1880s, the construction of roads rather promoted the clearances than prevented them. For as peaceful possession and ready access were established in these remote locations by means of road, the store farmers in the south soon appreciated the advantages and profits of sheep farms in the Highlands, and the people were for years without hesitation removed from their possessions in the 12th century to make way for these new arrangements. Building the roads didn't stop the clearances. In some ways, it accelerated them. And that's it. Just a note that what got me into looking at this was a couple of years ago in the Strathnairn newsletter there was an article about the Tordaric Bridge. I don't know if anyone remembers it. It was written by a guy called Professor Roland Paxton, who I got in touch with on the back of that and have been corresponding with him ever since, and he came up last summer. Turns out he's actually the country's leading authority on historical engineering stuff, and has been a great help and support and is interested in these things. I'm willing to take questions. I may not be able to answer them. Yes?
I've got an observation more than a question. It's really interesting, the A9 and the contractual debacle that's gone on in the Scottish Government to get the A9 duals. It sounds very similar to what they were going through when we get these roads.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Just one observation. You showed an advert for the let of an inn,
Yeah.
and also the Captain Mark.
Yeah.
There was a lot of inns in those days, like Flitty, I remember Flitty Inn, the old inn. But Croft Croy was an inn too, that was a cattle mark.
Oh, was it?
And I would say it lent itself more to that advert, because at the wee field beside it, which I remember, houses now occupied, there are buildings at the back, and it was at one time the cattle mark.
Sorry, I made a little mess of this.
Or fits in that advert.
Okay, right. I was trying to find the advert on the next slideshow. So, I'll look at it after, but yes, yes, absolutely.
Could you say a bit more about the landowners paid for the roads to be built? How did they recoup the money? Did they?
They were seen as being the main benefiters from the road, in terms of increased trade opportunities and so on. In some circumstances they put tolls on the road. They did not on the Inverfarraig Road. There were tolls on the Moy Road. And when they whether or not to put tolls on the road really depended on whether they thought there was an economic return on the tolls, because there's obviously expenses in putting in a toll house, employing a tollkeeper. So some roads were toll roads, which went partly to paying off the capital cost and partly on maintenance. Other roads were not toll roads. It was just purely they just paid for it, and maintenance was from government block grant.
The stone arch bridges that you've shown there, the Telford style, were they done using a wooden structure underneath?
Yes, yes. Build a wooden framework and then build a bridge on top of it, yes.
Finally put the keystone in?
Yes, and then when it's secure, then you drop the wooden structure out and take it.
With some trepidation?
I would imagine so, yes, yes.
They just look so beautiful.
Yeah.
Are the listed bridges under threat? I'm just thinking about the work being done to Flitty Bridge.
Listed bridges, I don't think so. Which ones are listed? I think it's just, well, Tordaric Bridge is listed, Littlemore Bridge, Dunmaglass Bridge. I don't think the other ones are listed at all. Flickety Bridge is coming out in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
Although, if you look closely at the cracks underneath it, you wouldn't want to be driving a heavy vehicle over it just now. Yeah, and so when the Little Mill Bridge was replaced 8 years ago, whatever it was, they were required to keep it, or did keep it.
One man I've read a wee bit about, who would drive on Thomas Telford, John Rennie. Did he build anything in the north at all?
The name rings a bell, but I'm not sure. Don't know.
I suspect that means no then.
Well, no, you could well have done. I don't know.
He came from East Lothian.
Right.
So he had his chance. Apparently Telford didn't like him very much.
All right. Well, maps are on the stage, if anybody wants to look. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Oh, down here.